The wind howled like a beast through the desolate valley, carrying the sharp edge of winter and the weight of a man's grim purpose. Silas Kane rode into the forgotten town of Ash Hollow, his coat dusted with frost, his revolver heavy at his hip. The townsfolk whispered of him, a debt collector with eyes like cold iron, sent by the ruthless banker Elias Crow to settle accounts no matter the cost. His mission was simple: find the widow, Clara Wren, and collect the $500 her late husband owed, or take her land by force. But as Silas dismounted in front of her crumbling cabin, the faint sound of children's laughter stopped him dead. Through the cracked window, he saw her, a woman with hollow cheeks, stirring a pot of thin broth, her tears falling into the meal as three small faces looked up at her with unshakable trust. Silas gripped the doorframe, his heart lurching. He'd come to kill a widow, but what he found was a mother feeding orphans with her sorrow. Clara Wren was no stranger to loss. 5 years ago, her husband, Thomas, a dreamer with a heart too big for his brittle body, borrowed heavily from Crow to buy a plot of land he swore would yield gold. The land gave nothing but dust, and tuberculosis took Thomas before he could repay a cent. Clara was left with their small cabin, a barren field, and a debt that grew like a shadow under Crow's unforgiving terms. Then came the orphans, 3 siblings abandoned by a fever that swept through Ash Hollow 2 winters past. Clara took them in, though she had nothing but her own grief to offer. She named them Lily, Ben, and Little Rose, and they became her reason to rise each morning, even when the pantry was bare and the cold seeped through the walls. Silas, hardened by years of chasing debtors across the frontier, expected to find a broken woman begging for mercy. Instead, Clara met his gaze with quiet defiance when he knocked. "I know why you're here," she said, her voice steady despite the tremble in her hands. "I have no money, Mr. Kane. But I have these children, and I'll not let you take what little we have." The orphans clung to her skirts, their wide eyes piercing Silas in a way no bullet ever could. He saw his own childhood reflected in them: hungry nights, a mother's whispered prayers, a father who never came home. He shoved the memory down and growled, "Crow wants his money. You've got till sundown tomorrow." The challenge was clear: Clara had no means to pay, and Silas had a reputation to uphold. Crow didn't tolerate failure, and Silas had seen what happened to those who crossed him: bodies left in ditches, families scattered to the wind. Yet, as he turned to leave, Little Rose, no older than 5, tugged at his coat. "Mister, are you hungry?" she asked, holding out a chipped bowl of watery soup. Silas froze. He hadn't eaten in days, but the gesture cracked something inside him. He muttered a refusal and stalked back to his horse, the weight of his task heavier than ever. That night, Silas camped on the outskirts of Ash Hollow, unable to ride away. The wind carried the faint sound of Clara singing a lullaby to the children, and it haunted him. He thought of his own mother, who'd died scraping by to feed him after his father gambled their savings away. Silas had sworn never to be weak like her, never to let sentiment cloud his purpose. But Clara's tears, her fierce love for those children, gnawed at him. By dawn, he returned to the cabin, telling himself he'd scare her into compliance. Instead, he found her chopping wood with a dull axe, her hands bleeding from the effort. "You don't give up, do you?" he said, almost to himself. Clara didn't look up. "Not when they're counting on me." The day unfolded in tense fragments. Silas lingered, watching Clara teach Ben to read from a tattered Bible, seeing Lily braid Rose's hair with careful fingers. He learned their stories: Lily, 12, who dreamed of being a teacher; Ben, 10, who whittled sticks into crude toys; Rose, who carried a rag doll she called Mama. Clara moved through their world with a quiet strength, stretching every scrap of food, every flicker of warmth, to keep them safe. Silas began to question his purpose. Crow's money felt distant compared to the reality of these lives. But the deadline loomed, and he knew Crow's men would come if he failed. The turning point came that afternoon. Ben, curious and bold, asked Silas why he carried a gun. The question caught him off guard, and before he could stop himself, Silas told the boy about his own childhood, how he'd learned to survive by being hard, by never trusting anyone. Clara overheard, her eyes softening. "You're not as cold as you think," she said quietly. "You're still here, aren't you?" Her words stung, and Silas stormed out, but he couldn't shake the truth in them. He realized he didn't want to be Crow's weapon anymore, not here, not for her. By sundown, Silas made his choice. He rode back to the cabin, his revolver still at his side but his heart unmoored. "I'm not taking your land," he told Clara. "But Crow won't stop." You need to leave, all of you, tonight. Clara shook her head. This is our home. I won't run. Silas saw the fire in her eyes and knew arguing was futile. Instead, he offered a plan. He'd face Crow himself, tell him the debt was uncollectible, and buy Clara time to find a way out. It was a gamble. Crow didn't forgive defiance, but Silas was done being a pawn. The next morning, Silas rode to Crow's office in the next town, his pulse steady but his mind racing. He expected threats, maybe a fight. What he didn't expect was Crow's laughter. You've gone soft, Kane, the banker sneered, his men circling. You think you can walk away from me? Silas stood his ground, recounting Clara's story, the orphans, the tears, the unbreakable will. He offered his own savings, $200, to cover part of the debt, knowing it wasn't enough. Crow's eyes narrowed. You're done here, he said, and Silas knew he'd made an enemy for life. Back in Ash Hollow, Silas warned Clara that Crow's men would come eventually, but she refused to flee. Instead, she rallied the town folks who'd been too scared or broken to stand up before. They pooled what little they had, a few dollars, some grain, a promise of labor. It wasn't enough to clear the debt, but it was enough to show Crow that Clara wasn't alone. Silas stayed, teaching Ben how to shoot, helping Lily mend the cabin's roof, carrying Rose when she grew tired. He didn't know if he was redeeming himself or just delaying the inevitable, but for the first time, he felt like he belonged. Months later, word came that Crow had died in a saloon brawl, his empire crumbling under mismanaged loans. The debt was forgotten, but Clara and the children never were. Silas didn't stay. He wasn't built for settling down, but he left Ash Hollow changed. Clara's tears had fed more than the orphans, they'd watered a seed of humanity in him he thought long dead. As he rode away, Lily ran after him, pressing a whittled wooden star into his hand. For luck, she said. Silas smiled, tucking it into his pocket. "To watching this story unfold, know this, sometimes, the debts we carry aren't about money but about the choices we make when no one's watching." Clara fed 3 orphans with her tears, but she also fed a man's soul back to him. And maybe, just maybe, her courage can remind us all that even in our darkest moments, we can choose to give, to fight, to love. So, what will you choose today? Subscribe, share, and let's keep telling stories that matter.